When DE first announced the Warframe, which would eventually become Octavia, I was really excited but worried at the same time. I was worried because she could end up being another Limbo, a gimmicky Warframe that just, as Mogamu put it, farts tunes. Because how exactly do you design 4 abilities that are all themed around music but don't feel the same? And more importantly, how do you make a Warframe that can play music without it being eardrum-piercingly annoying? Well, let's find out. So first out, to get Octavia, you will have to finish Octavia's Anthem, which is a quest given by Cephalon Suda on any of the relays. Simply go to her room, talk to her, and select the option Music with a question mark. And don't worry, I will not spoil the quest line for you. Now, once you get the blueprint for Octavia, you will have to go and farm the blueprint for the chassis, systems, and neuroptics as well. I already made a short, spoiler-free guide on how to get all of them, which you can watch by clicking the annotation on the screen right now or the link in the description. But if you don't want to watch it, the TLDR version is the blueprint for the neuroptics is about a 20% chance to drop on rotation C in Orokin Downlight Survival. You can get the blueprint for the systems from the hidden caches you find in the Plateau Crossfire Extermination mission on Lua, and the blueprint for the chassis can be found in a special container that will spawn on top of the central organ in this room right here once you complete the music puzzle. Just light up the pressure plates by standing on them in the same order that they light up once you interact with the console. Octavia is not a tank, but she's not squishy either. She has 100 health, which will go up to 300 at rank 30, 75 shields, which will go up to 225 at rank 30, and 125 armor. Now, if you want some comparison in terms of tankiness, I would say she feels about as tanky as Sarin. She also has 150 power, which will go up to 225 at rank 30, sprint speed of 1.05, and she comes with 3 polarities, 2 dashes, and an additional dash in the aura slot. On their own, Octavia's abilities are fine, they're okay, but they really start to shine when you combine them together. You have the Mallet, your drum, Resonator, the bass, Metronome, the melody, and finally an Amplifier, which synergizes with the other 3 and, unsurprisingly, amplifies their effect, as well as buffing you and all your allies. So let's finally check them out, shall we? And let's start off with the drum, or the Mallet, Octavia's first ability, where Octavia throws a spherical music device in an arc towards the direction she aims, which upon impact will deploy a mallet that will hover in place for 20 seconds. And even though the mallet is invulnerable and can't be destroyed, the enemies will still try to do so. Now, all the damage that the enemies pump into the mallet will be stored and multiplied by 250% before it's rhythmically dealt to all enemies within 10 meters of the mallet. The duration of the mallet is affected by power duration, the damage multiplier is affected by power strength, and the radius of the mallet is affected by power range. Now, we can also combo the mallet with 2 different abilities to get a different effect or a stronger effect, but I will first cover each ability separately and then I will go over the combos and synergies, alright? Now, the way the mallet reflects damage back to enemies is based on the song that you've set up in your Manda chord. More specifically to the mallet, the percussion part, because it will deal damage with each note. So a setup like this will reflect high amounts of damage with each note, but it's not going to be as frequent, and a setup like this will deal damage basically all the time to a point where they will layer over each other, but the amount of reflected damage is going to be much lower. And from the testing I did, I found it far more effective to reflect smaller amounts of damage very frequently. And finally, the mallet requires a line of sight of the enemies in order to deal damage. The bass, also known as Resonator, her second ability, will throw out a roller ball that will roll around for 20 seconds. This is essentially a roller spectre that has a 6-meter aura around it. When an enemy enters the aura, it will expand it a little bit up to a maximum of 15 meters and the enemy will be charmed, ceasing all aggression. And literally all they will do once they're charmed is just follow the Resonator around. Now, while the enemies are charmed and they're within the aura radius, the Resonator will damage them in a very similar way to the Mallet. So it's once again based on the song you set up in your Manda chord, but this time around it's based on the bass part. So a setup like this with just a couple of notes every now and then will do higher amounts of damage but less frequently, and a setup like this that plays notes all the time will do lower amounts of damage, but it will damage them far more often. However, as you can see, the damage of the Mallet on its own is very low. It only does 125 damage. So you mostly use this ability for the charm, which is a fantastic form of crowd control. The duration of the Mallet is affected by power duration, the radius of the aura is affected by power range, and the damage of the Mallet is affected by power strength. Now the Melody, also known as Metronome, her third ability, is a very cool ability indeed. This ability is based entirely on the melody part of your song that you've created in your manda chord, because every note you add to the melody part will create a circle that will move towards you once you activate the ability. Now this is essentially a very simplified version of Guitar Hero, because if you perform actions just as the rings are about to hit you, you will get a buff. But you don't get the buff immediately, you will have to perform various amounts of these actions to stack the buff up, and this is once again based on the amount of notes that you have in your melody. Having fewer notes in the melody means you have to be more precise, but it also means you only have to hit the timing 2 or 3 times to get the buff. And having a ton of notes playing all the time means you don't have to be as precise and you can somewhat spam it, though you do have to hit the timing on far more of these actions than with the other setup. And even though this may look like the way to go because you can just spam your way to the buffs, you will lose a percentage of the stack for the buff you're going for every time you miss a note. And as I was playing with this more and more, I found it far easier to get the buffs when I had fewer notes. Now once you activate Metronome, it will create a 12-meter aura that lasts for 20 seconds and gives Octavia and her allies 35% bonus armor. The radius of the aura is affected by power range, the duration by power duration, and the armor bonus is affected by power strength. Now, in addition to the armor buff, there are 4 different buffs you can get by performing certain actions: Vives, Nocturne, Opera, and Forte. Vives is a 30% movement speed buff that lasts for 15 seconds. However, the speed bonus can be affected by power strength on Octavia, and the buff duration can be affected by power duration on Octavia. And Octavia and her allies can get this buff by jumping, double jumping, wall climbing, or wall jumping, bullet jumping, or performing any acrobatic actions just as the rings hit Octavia. The second buff is Nocturne, which is a 15-second cloak that is once again affected by the power duration values on Octavia, and you get this one by either sliding or crouching just as the rings hit Octavia. The third buff, Opera, is a 30% multi-shot buff that lasts for 15 seconds. However, the multi-shot bonus is affected by power strength on Octavia, and the duration of the multi-shot is once again affected by power duration on Octavia. And this one is fairly easy to get, you just have to shoot just as once again the rings hit Octavia. And Forte, the fourth buff, is a 30% melee damage bonus that lasts for 15 seconds. The duration is once again affected by power duration on Octavia, and the melee bonus you get from this is affected by power strength on Octavia. And unsurprisingly, you get this one by swinging your melee weapon as the rings hit Octavia. And I'm really sorry, I know this explanation was very long-winded and it wasn't very fluid in the way I explained it, but I have no idea how else I would describe this ability properly. Metronome is in my opinion one of the coolest abilities in the game, though I do find the way to get the speed buff by jumping somewhat awkward, but that's mostly to do with the way Warframes jump and not with the ability itself. This ability is incredibly versatile. I mean, the armor bonus on its own is pretty damn good, but getting a little bit of multi-shot by shooting in rhythm, or melee damage by swinging your melee weapon in rhythm, or even movement speed by jumping in rhythm is really cool. And the cloak you get from Metronome is amazing, because if you have at least a little bit of power duration, you can easily stealth through an entire mission with it. And finally, we come to the Amplifier, Octavia's fourth ability, where Octavia transforms the ground into a dance floor. This will create a field with a radius of 14 meters that lasts for 30 seconds, and this field will take the sound levels of the environment and amplify your weapon damage based on how loud the environment is. And this bonus can range from 25% when it's really quiet all the way to 200% if it's very loud. The radius of the field is affected by power range, the duration by power duration, and the maximum and minimum damage multipliers are affected by power strength. Now the amplifier field will take into account all different kinds of noise when determining how strong of a buff you're gonna get. And this includes all kinds of gunfire, footsteps, alarms, and melee strikes, as well as all 3 of your abilities, so the Mallet, Resonator, and Metronome. And 99% of the time, all you have to do to get the full weapon buff is to just throw down all 3 of your abilities and play your song. And that's pretty much it for the abilities, so before we check out the combos you can do with the abilities, I just want to say that all 4 of Octavia's abilities are considered a two-handed action, so even though she's usually just using one hand to deploy the ability, it will interrupt things like reloading. Now let's talk a little bit about the combos and the synergies you can get with Octavia's abilities. So number 1, if you deploy your Mallet and your Resonator at the same time, the Resonator will pick up the Mallet and wheel it around. This may seem like a good thing because otherwise the Mallet is a stationary ability, so you would have to redeploy it over and over and over again if you're not playing something like a defense mission, but it's really not. Because what ends up happening is the Resonator will charm the enemies and they will stop shooting at the Mallet, reducing the damage output of the Mallet quite significantly. And I really don't know if this is a bug and the enemies are actually supposed to shoot the mallet when the resonator is wheeling it around, or if it's supposed to work this way. It's kind of nice to have in a mission where you are not stationary, so something like an exterminate or a capture mission, but in something like defense, I would not bother with the resonator. I would just drop the mallet and let the enemies shoot it. Though I would only recommend doing this if you don't need to crowd control the enemies with the resonator. And number 2, this is pretty crazy, dropping a mallet on top of your amplifier field will double its damage and its range. This allows you to cover an enormous area and dish out an absolute truck ton of damage, especially if you add a little bit of power strength and maybe a little bit of power range as well. Though don't overdo it with the power range, since the mallet does need a line of sight of the enemies. And finally we come to the conclusion. So would I recommend Octavia? Yes, I would. This is a brilliantly designed Warframe. Well, aside from the resonator taunting the enemies so they don't shoot the mallet thing. As I said in the beginning, I was worried that she would end up being another Limbo but with music instead of the Rift. She didn't. She is fantastic. She is a lot of fun to play. She's not too squishy, which as someone who likes to play tanky Warframes, I really like. And while her abilities can sometimes turn the mission into just a diarrhea of particle and light effects, they look fantastic. So yes, Octavia gets a big thumbs up from me. You need to get this Warframe. She is really good. And that's pretty much it for the video. I've been rambling for long enough, I think. So I thank you very much for watching. I hope the video was helpful, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.